Hi everybody, this is Mr. Saenz-Payne, and I'm here to go over Lesson 1, an Introduction to American Imperialism. The focus of this lesson is to explain how Western expansion from the Atlantic Ocean in the east all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the west influenced American imperialism overseas later. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start by talking about Western expansion. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the American government and American settlers pushed west. American settlers were focused on the West for four reasons. The first reason is property. Land in the West was extremely cheap, opening up opportunities for settlers to own land. The second is escape from religious persecution. Mostly this was the Mormons trying to find a colony that will allow them to practice their religion without persecution from Catholics or Protestants. There was also a desire for Christians to spread Christianity to native people. The third was economic opportunities, specifically trying to create new markets for goods and to get access to more resources to produce more goods. The last was the idea, the belief that it was their manifest destiny. And I want to take a couple of minutes to explain what the term manifest destiny means. Let's go ahead and look at this image. This is an iconic image that came to symbolize manifest destiny. So if we focus right here in the middle, you have this very, very large angel-looking woman that is carrying a book that says school book and wires that's connecting to electrical poles. If you notice, everything behind her, all the land that she has already went into, that she's leaving from, is symbolized by different images of industrialization. You have railroads moving westward. You have these electric lines that I mentioned earlier, where she's actually holding and laying these lines as she's moving west. And then in the back corner, you see ports, boats symbolizing commerce, and even a bridge symbolizing industrialization. Down here in the bottom corner, you have settlers that are plowing fields, symbolizing agriculture. Everything in front of her, the land that she has not yet entered, if you notice the contrast, it's dark, it's very gloomy, and even the buffalo and the Native Americans are running away from her. And so this image kind of symbolizes this idea that everywhere that America colonizes becomes modernized. This is a symbol of America civilizing the uncivilized West. So by definition, manifest destiny is the idea that God ordained the U.S. to control the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from East Coast to West Coast. Using this idea of manifest destiny, settlers pushed into Native American land and also land owned by Mexico. That's going to create tension that we're going to be discussing throughout this lesson. By connecting Western expansion to the idea of God and Christianity, the American government and settlers were willing to do pretty horrific things in order to fulfill this manifest destiny to settle all of North America. So let's talk about two specific outcomes, two specific consequences of Western expansion. The first is increased conflicts with Native American tribes. This is going to lead to what's known as the Native American or the American Indian Wars. The second is tension between American settlers and the government of Mexico. Two specific conflicts is going to emerge. One is the Texas Revolution, and the second is the American-Mexican War. So let's go over those specifically one by one. The American Indian Wars. Technically, Americans and Native American tribes have been in conflict with each other since the first settlement of Jamestown in the early 1600s. But by definition, the American Indian Wars is going to last from 1803, after the Louisiana Purchase, all the way into the 1890s. The American Indian Wars consisted of many different conflicts between Native Americans and the U.S. colonial and national government. The largest and most violent of these conflicts came when the U.S. government expanded west after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. After the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. Deadly conflict intensified as Native American tribes refused to leave their land. In the end, though, the U.S. government was able to overpower Native American tribes and force them onto reservations. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a interactive map that will show you the land initially owned by Native Americans and the land that eventually is going to become Native American reservations. Let's go ahead and take a look. As you see, the blue is diminishing as the date increases. And as you see orange emerge, that is going to be the first reservations, going to end up by 2010 showing you the last reservations, the current reservations. Let's look at it one more time. The blue is the original Native American homeland, and the orange is going to symbolize the reservations that are going to be developed in more modern history. As you can see, Native Americans lost almost all of their land as America expanded west. All right, now let's shift gears and talk about American conflict with Mexico. So there's going to be two conflicts we're going to talk about, one in Texas and one with Mexico when it comes to the Mexican-American War. In what is now Texas, there were two groups emerging. One are the Anglos, the second are the Tejanos. Anglos were English-speaking settlers that came from the American East. Tejanos were Mexican settlers that migrated north from central Mexico. Differences in culture, mostly religion and language, and opinions about slavery created tension between the Anglos in Texas and the Tejanos of Texas. The American Anglos spoke English and were Protestant and in a lot of cases opposed Catholicism and wanted to expand slavery into Texas. The Tejanos, on the other hand, spoke Spanish and were Catholic, and they did not want to expand slavery into Texas because Mexico outlawed slavery in 1829. This conflict over culture and slavery is going to lead to what's known as the Texas Revolution. So let's take a minute and talk about the Texas Revolution. Due to the conflict over language, culture, and slavery, American settlers led by Stephen Austin went into central Mexico in order to ask then President Antonio Lopez Santa Anna for more rights for the American settlers in Texas. In response to Austin's plea for more rights for the Anglo settlers, Santa Anna threw Austin in prison. He did this as a way of gaining control and showing that at this time, that land was owned by Mexico and all settlers living in that territory had to follow Mexican law. In the end, Austin was freed, and when he returned to Texas, he launched what's known as the Texas Revolution. There's going to be one very iconic battle that's going to be a Mexican victory at what's known as the Alamo. The slogan, "Remember the Alamo," was used throughout the Texas Revolution and even later during the Mexican-American War as a calling to American settlers to help fight against Mexico and what they perceived to be an intrusion and a violation of their rights as American settlers. After the Alamo, the American settlers captured Santa Anna. So the same way that Santa Anna was able to imprison Austin, the American settlers in Texas were able to imprison Santa Anna. After negotiations, Santa Anna was released in exchange for Texas independence. In 1836, Sam Houston, pictured right there below, was elected president to the new Republic of Texas. For 9 years, Texas was an independent country. It was the Lone Star State. After, in 1845, Texas entered America as a state. The last conflict we're going to talk about is the Mexican-American War. After Texas entered the U.S. as a state in 1845, then President James Polk wanted to purchase California and New Mexico from Mexico. But Mexico refused. They did not want the American government that close into central Mexico. During the negotiations, Polk also attempted to expand the border of Texas from what was the border at the Nueces River into what he wanted to be the border at the Rio Grande to the south. If you look at this image, the blue river right here is the Nueces River. That was the established border between the Texas Republic and the Mexican government when it comes to Mexican territory. James Polk wanted to expand the border of Texas into the Rio Grande River right here along the south. This disputed territory in between was the land that Mexico wanted to keep and America wanted to claim. This land is what's going to lead to the Mexican-American War. During the negotiations, 11 American soldiers were killed by Mexican troops in that disputed territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. In the eyes of America, led by Polk, Americans were killed on American soil because they believed that the border was at the Rio Grande River. In the eyes of the Mexican government, those Mexican troops killed 11 American soldiers that were invading their land, and they felt justified in the conflict between the troops. Either way, the American government was able to successfully declare war on Mexico when Congress officially declared war, starting what's known as the Mexican-American War. After several battles, and American victories, the U.S. and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, days after gold was discovered in California. In the treaty, the U.S. gained New Mexico and California, which is now present-day California, Nevada, New Mexico, parts of Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado. They paid $15 million to Mexico for this land, but it drastically increased the size of the American mainland and American territory. They were also successfully, under the treaty, able to establish the Rio Grande as the official border between Texas and Mexico. I want to take a minute and talk about the gold rush. What I find very interesting about this time period is at this time, news traveled very slow. There was no internet. Publications had to travel by snail mail, meaning that they had to transport news by land, instead of today where we have the internet and we have freight and air to get messages and publications spread a lot quicker. So when gold was finally established and finally found in California in the beginning of 1848, by the time Mexico got wind of that news, they already signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, securing that gold for America. Just think about what that might have done to the Mexican government had they been able to use the gold found in California to build and expand their economy and the Mexican government. It's kind of one of those what ifs of history. What if they caught wind of the gold rush before they signed that treaty? We will never know. So the impact of Western expansion. In addition to negative impacts with Native Americans in Mexico, like we mentioned in this lesson, Western expansion created a blueprint for overseas expansion. Very similar to the way America moved west, many businesses also wanted to expand overseas for economic reasons. The government also wanted to expand American influence overseas. So let's talk about three specific things that connect Western expansion to later American imperialism. Western expansion was drastically influenced by new markets and cheap labor and resources. The same is going to happen when it comes to America expanding overseas into different parts of the world. America is going to want to open up new markets in these overseas territories. They're going to want to get access to new materials and more natural resources and utilize cheap labor by being able to have people in other countries produce goods for America without American regulation. The second is they wanted to gain access to not only natural resources, but also to a global presence, to be able to establish a global presence on behalf of America around the world. And then lastly, they wanted to spread Christianity the same way that the American settlers wanted to expand Christianity into Native American territory. Later on, America's going to want to expand Christianity and democracy into other countries and other parts of the world with American expansion overseas. In addition, the same idea of manifest destiny that was used to justify Western expansion using religion, a term called social Darwinism is also going to be used during American expansion overseas as a way of justifying American dominance over what was perceived to be inferior people around the globe. So just to recap, America pushed west in an extremely alarming rate. And because of that Western expansion, there was direct conflict between Native Americans and the Mexican government. The things that were used to justify and promote Western expansion, economic opportunity, the ability to own land, the idea of spreading Christianity and trying to civilize the uncivilized Native Americans, those same reasons were going to be used later to justify expansion overseas into parts of Asia, parts of Latin America, and beyond. Thank you guys very much for joining me in this lesson. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email your teachers and reach out to us directly. Thank you guys and have a great day.